You wake up every day and react. Something annoys you, and you snap. Something scares you, and you freeze. Something excites you, and you chase it without thinking. You live most of your life on autopilot, letting the world push you around like a leaf in the wind. And you probably think that's just what it means to be human. But across 2,500 years, across completely different cultures, religions, and worldviews, the philosophers who actually changed how people live all landed on the same quiet habit. Not a belief. Not a ritual. A habit. And it's so simple you've probably dismissed it before. It's this: you pause before you react, and you look at your own mind before you look at the world. That's it. That's the habit every serious philosopher, in every tradition, kept coming back to. Socrates called it examining yourself. Marcus Aurelius called it writing to himself every night. Seneca called it reviewing his day before sleep. The Buddha called it mindfulness. Lao Tzu called it stillness. Even Nietzsche, the philosopher everyone assumes was all fire and chaos, built his entire framework on brutal self-honesty, on looking directly at what you actually want instead of what you pretend to want. You've been taught that the good life comes from getting things. A better job. A better body. A better relationship. More money. More recognition. And so you spend your whole life chasing external upgrades while your internal world, the actual place where you experience everything, stays completely unexamined. You upgrade your phone every 2 years, and you haven't upgraded your understanding of your own mind since you were a teenager. Socrates walked around Athens asking people questions until they realized they didn't actually know what they thought they knew. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He was showing them that an unexamined belief is just noise you inherited from someone else. He said the unexamined life is not worth living, and he meant it literally. Not worth living. Because if you never look at your own assumptions, you're not actually alive in any meaningful sense. You're just running a program someone else installed in you when you were a child. You inherited most of your opinions. About money, about relationships, about what success looks like, about what you deserve, about what's normal. You didn't choose them. You absorbed them from parents, from school, from culture, from whatever algorithm has been feeding you content since you were 12. Socrates would ask you a simple question right now. Do you actually believe that, or did someone hand it to you? And you probably don't know the answer, because you've never stopped long enough to check. Now go 500 years later, to a Roman emperor who ruled the most powerful empire on earth. Marcus Aurelius had more external power than almost anyone in human history. Armies. Wealth. Absolute authority. And yet every single night, he sat down and wrote to himself. Not for anyone else to read. Not for legacy. He was reminding himself what actually mattered, catching himself when he'd been arrogant, impatient, or petty that day. Those notes became meditations, one of the most read books in human history, and it was never even meant to be a book. It was a man having the exact same habit as a poor street philosopher in Athens 5 centuries earlier. Different rank. Same behavior. Look inward before you look outward. Seneca did the same thing. He wrote that he questioned his whole day every single night, asking himself what habit he'd cured, what fault he'd resisted, where he'd improved. Not to punish himself. To notice himself. He said that if you don't observe your own mind, you're doomed to be dragged around by whatever emotion shows up first, and whatever emotion shows up first is usually not your best one. It's fear, or irritation, or envy. The people who seem calm and grounded aren't calm because nothing bothers them. They're calm because they caught the feeling before it caught them. You do the opposite. You feel something and you act on it in the same second. Someone sends a message that annoys you, and you reply while you're still angry. You feel insecure at work, so you either overcompensate or shut down completely, and you don't even notice you're doing it. The gap between feeling and action, that tiny space where a whole different life is possible, has basically disappeared for you. Philosophy, at its core, across every tradition, is the art of widening that gap. Now travel east, and you find the exact same discovery showing up independently. The Buddha didn't have access to Athens or Rome. He built his entire teaching around watching the mind directly. He noticed that suffering doesn't come from what happens to you, it comes from how tightly you grip onto what happens to you. And the only way to loosen that grip is to actually watch it happening. Not think about your thoughts. Watch them, the way you'd watch weather pass through the sky. That watching is the whole practice. It's why meditation isn't about relaxing. It's about observing yourself clearly enough that you stop being controlled by whatever crosses your mind. Taoism arrives at almost the same place through a completely different door. Lao Tzu talks about stillness, about not forcing things, about acting without straining. He wasn't telling you to be lazy. He was telling you that most of your effort is wasted fighting your own reactions instead of working with reality as it is. The person who has to control everything is usually the person who has never sat still long enough to understand what's actually happening inside them. Water doesn't fight the rock. It moves around it, calmly, because it isn't reacting emotionally to the obstacle. It's just responding to what's real. And then there's Nietzsche, who gets misunderstood constantly because people only quote the parts of him that sound aggressive. But underneath the intensity, Nietzsche's whole project was self-honesty taken to an extreme level. He wanted you to stop lying to yourself about your own motives. He asked, brutally, whether your morality is actually yours, or whether it's just something weak people invented to control strong people, whether your guilt is real conviction or just inherited fear. He wanted you to examine your own psychology so closely that you couldn't hide behind comfortable excuses anymore. That's not nihilism. That's the same habit Socrates had, just with sharper edges. So here's what's actually happening. Every one of these thinkers, separated by centuries, continents, and completely different assumptions about the universe, arrived at the same discovery through direct experience. They noticed that human beings suffer not because life is inherently unbearable, but because people almost never look directly at their own minds. They react instead of observe. They inherit beliefs instead of examining them. They let the first emotion drive the car instead of checking who's actually in the driver's seat. You can build this habit starting today, and it doesn't require robes, retreats, or rearranging your whole life. It requires one small shift. Before you respond to something that triggers you, you pause for 3 seconds and ask what you're actually feeling and why. At the end of your day, you spend 2 minutes reviewing it honestly, the way Seneca did, not to judge yourself, but to notice patterns. When you catch yourself holding a strong opinion, you ask whether it's actually yours or whether you just absorbed it from somewhere, the way Socrates would have pushed you to. That's the whole habit. Pause, observe, question. It looks unremarkable from the outside. Nobody claps for you when you do it. There's no trophy for noticing your own mind. But every philosopher who actually changed how people live, whether they were teaching in the Athens marketplace, running the Roman Empire, sitting under a tree in ancient India, or writing furious books in the Swiss mountains, discovered that this quiet inward pause is the foundation everything else is built on. You don't need to read all of Meditations or memorize the Tao Te Ching to start. You just need to catch yourself once today, right before you react, and ask what's actually going on in your mind. Do that enough times, and you stop being a leaf in the wind. You become the person who decides which way to move. That's the one habit every philosopher, in every era, in every corner of the world, quietly agreed on. Not happiness. Not success. Just this. Look inward before you look outward, and everything else starts to change.